The lighthouse stood like a skeletal giant at the edge of the cliff, its tower stretching high into the sky as if it still tried to call ships home, though no flame had burned inside it for decades. Waves crashed violently against the jagged rocks below, sending up sprays of salt water that misted the air. The locals in the nearest fishing village had warned them not to stay overnight, claimed the place was cursed, that the last keepers had vanished without a trace, but for the group of 5 friends, that only made the idea more thrilling. To them, it wasn't a warning, it was a challenge. They arrived at sunset, backpacks slung over shoulders, laughter echoing against the wind, though underneath their excitement lingered a nervous unease none of them admitted aloud. The door to the lighthouse was old and swollen with years of sea air, but when Liam pushed hard against it, it groaned open, revealing the spiraling staircase that wound upward like a throat-swallowing darkness. The air inside smelled of damp stone and rusted metal. Dust motes drifted lazily in the fading orange light. For a moment, they all stood silently, as though the building itself was holding its breath. By nightfall, they had set up their sleeping bags in what used to be the keepers' quarters. Old oil lamps, rusted tools, and a massive ledger still sat on a cracked wooden table, left behind as though the keepers had abandoned their posts mid-shift. When they lit candles, the flames bent and flickered as though pulled by an unseen draft, though the windows had long been sealed shut. Outside, the sea roared endlessly, but beneath the rhythm of the waves, they began to notice something stranger, faint knocks echoing within the walls, as if someone was tapping from the inside of the stone tower itself. It was Emma who first spotted it. At dawn, when the tide was low, she stepped outside to take photos of the cliffs, only to see words scratched deep into the wet sand below. "Turn back." The letters were large enough that the others could read them from the cliff's edge when she called them over. But when the tide surged back an hour later, the warning disappeared beneath the waves, erased as if it had never been there at all. Still, they stayed. And as the days passed, the lighthouse seemed less like an abandoned relic and more like a living, breathing presence that had been waiting for them. The second night in the lighthouse was colder, though the wind outside was calmer than the first. The group huddled in the keeper's quarters around a small camping lantern, its sterile light throwing harsh shadows on the damp stone walls. Liam cracked jokes to mask his unease, while Emma scrolled through the photos she'd taken earlier, the ones with the message in the sand. Yet, when she flipped through her gallery, her face paled. The words were gone. In the photos, the sand looked untouched, as if no message had ever existed. She didn't say anything to the others right away, not wanting to sound paranoid, but her hands trembled as she shut off the screen. Around midnight, as silence pressed down over the group, the first sound came. A low, dragging scrape, like metal against stone, echoed faintly from the spiral staircase. They all froze, glancing toward the darkened stairwell that wound upward into blackness. "Probably just the wind," Marcus muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. But the scrape came again, closer this time, sharper, as if someone was slowly dragging an anchor up the stairs. "Should we check it out?" Zoe whispered. Her question hung in the air, met with silence. Then Liam, ever the one to prove himself, grabbed the lantern and stepped toward the staircase. Each footstep of his echoed through the hollow tower as he began to ascend. The others waited below, their ears straining for any sound. The lantern's glow rose higher, flickering against the stone. Liam's voice called down after a minute, tight with unease, "There's nothing here, just rusted rails and broken steps." He stopped suddenly. Silence fell, then came his frantic whisper, "Wait. I think there's writing on the wall." Emma's stomach dropped. "What does it say?" The lantern's light jittered as Liam leaned closer to read. His voice quavered as he called down, "It says, 'Do not open the door below.'" A chill ran through the group as they exchanged glances. "Door below?" Zoe repeated, confused. They hadn't seen any doors other than the entrance they'd come through. But as Liam descended back to them, pale and shaken, they all heard it, the faint, rhythmic knock knock knock, this time beneath their feet. It wasn't the sound of wind, or shifting stone, or waves against the cliff. No. It was precise. Deliberate. Someone, or something, was knocking from the floor beneath them. Marcus grabbed the lantern and crouched low, inspecting the warped floorboards. "It's hollow," he whispered. He knocked back, and the wood vibrated under his hand. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then came a reply, 3 sharp knocks that rattled through the planks like a heartbeat. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They just stared at one another, frozen, until Zoe finally breathed the words that none of them wanted to hear, "There's a room under us." Emma's eyes flicked to the ledger on the table, its cracked leather cover glistening faintly in the lantern's glow. She opened it again, flipping past the lists of dates and weather notes. This time, she noticed the last page. The ink was smudged, the words uneven, as though the hand that wrote them had been trembling. It read, "The tide will cover the entrance again. Lock the cavern. Do not let it out." At that moment, as though the lighthouse itself had been listening, the knocking stopped. But the silence that followed felt worse, like whatever waited below was now awake, and aware of them. Morning came slow and heavy, as if the sky itself resented the idea of light touching the abandoned lighthouse. The group awoke to the sound of gulls screaming overhead and the waves crashing harder than the day before. Emma barely slept, her mind kept circling back to the ledger's final words, the hollow thuds beneath the floor, and that unnerving message Liam had found painted on the stairwell wall. She hadn't told the others about her vanished photo, or how she could still swear she'd seen something move outside in the sand the previous night, even though no footprints had been left behind. They tried to eat breakfast, but the food tasted bland, metallic, almost as though the air in the lighthouse had tainted everything it touched. Zoe picked at her granola bar, eyes fixed on the floorboards, as though expecting the knocks to return. Marcus, determined to keep everyone calm, suggested they explore the cliffs at low tide. "Maybe there really is a door down there. Better to know than sit here jumping at every sound." By mid-afternoon, the tide began to recede, sucking the water back from the jagged shoreline and revealing dark, glistening stone that had been hidden the day before. The 5 of them climbed carefully down the narrow path beside the lighthouse, boots crunching against sharp rocks slick with algae. The air smelled of salt and something fouler, like rot that had been trapped under water for centuries. Emma was the first to see it, a massive slab of iron embedded into the cliff wall, half covered in barnacles and seaweed. It wasn't just a natural formation. It was a door. Rust streaked down its surface like dried blood, and carved across its face were words almost erased by time, "Keep sealed." The group froze, the sound of the ocean crashing behind them. Liam let out a nervous laugh. "This is insane. It's like something out of a horror movie." But his laugh faltered when Emma touched the corroded metal and felt the vibration beneath it, steady, rhythmic, like a pulse. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, drawing her hand back. Marcus pressed his ear against the cold surface, his expression draining of color. "There's something moving behind it." They stood in silence, the sound of distant shifting echoing faintly through the iron. Then, slowly, 3 distinct knocks rattled against the other side. Zoe staggered back, clutching her arms as goosebumps spread across her skin. "It knows we're here." The ocean wind picked up, whistling through the rocks like a voice trying to form words. Emma thought she heard it whisper her name, carried on the salt spray, but when she turned, no one else reacted. She didn't dare mention it. Instead, she pulled the group's attention back to the ledger's warning. It said not to let it out. Whatever's behind this door, it was locked here for a reason. Or it's someone trapped, Liam argued, though even he didn't sound convinced. His voice cracked at the end, and his gaze kept darting back toward the iron slab as if he, too, felt the malevolence seeping through it. They argued for a while, whether to leave it alone, to tell the locals, or to try prying it open, but the tide began to creep back, cutting off the discussion. Water rushed in, licking hungrily at their boots, rising faster than they expected. They had no choice but to retreat back to the lighthouse. As the waves swallowed the door once more, Emma glanced over her shoulder. For the briefest moment, she swore she saw something on the other side of the iron, a shadow pressed against the seam, a hand-shaped outline against the metal, reaching for release. When they made it back to the safety of the lighthouse, drenched and breathless, Zoe whispered the thought that had already wormed into all their minds. If the tide covers it every day, how long before it breaks free on its own? The silence that followed was worse than the knocking. That night, the storm came suddenly, with a violence that rattled the lighthouse to its foundations. The group had barely finished drying their clothes from their excursion to the cavern when the first thunderclap shook the windows. Wind screamed through the tower's cracks, howling like something alive. The lantern light flickered violently as though the storm outside was trying to snuff it out. Emma sat cross-legged near the ledger, tracing the final words again and again, her lips moving silently. Lock the cavern. Do not let it out. The phrase had lodged itself in her mind like a splinter she couldn't dislodge. She barely noticed Zoe staring out one of the narrow windows until the girl whispered, "There's something out there." They all crowded near the glass, their reflections faintly ghosted against the night. At first, there was nothing, just the chaotic spray of waves against the rocks, the flash of lightning across the restless ocean. Then, another bolt illuminated the cliff face, and their breath caught in unison. A figure stood by the edge of the tide, impossibly still amid the chaos of the storm. It was tall, lean, its outline blurred by the sheets of rain. They could see no details of its face, only the unnatural way it seemed to be staring directly at the lighthouse, its head tilted, watching. When the lightning faded, the figure was gone. But before anyone could speak, another crash of thunder rolled through the air, and this time, the sound of knocking came with it, not beneath the floor, but from the very walls around them. 3 sharp raps, echoing through stone. Liam swore under his breath, pacing nervously. "We need to leave. Tomorrow, first thing, we get out of here and never look back." Marcus shook his head. "The tide cuts off the path half the day. If the storm gets worse, we'll be trapped on the cliffs. Better to wait it out." But even as he said it, the walls gave another hollow thud, this one vibrating through the floorboards until the lantern rattled on the table. It was no longer just a sound, it was as though the entire structure was being tested, probed by something unseen. Zoe's voice broke, trembling. "What if it's not outside? What if it's already in the lighthouse with us?" No one responded. They didn't need to. Because at that very moment, Emma noticed their reflections in the glass of the window. There were 5 of them huddled together, pale and terrified. But in the reflection, there were 6. The 6th figure stood a step behind them, taller than any of them, faceless, its presence looming like a shadow cut loose from its master. When she blinked, it was gone. Only their 5 reflections remained. She didn't tell the others. She couldn't. Instead, she sat back, clutching the ledger so tightly the edges dug into her palms, and tried to ignore the whisper that brushed against her ear as the storm roared outside, soft, cold, and unmistakably real. "It is waiting for you." The storm did not pass with the night. By morning, it had only worsened. Rain lashed sideways against the lighthouse walls, seeping through unseen cracks to pool across the warped floorboards. The sea below churned like a living beast, swallowing and spitting out boulders with a force that made the ground tremble. Any hope of leaving that day was gone, the cliffside path had been washed out entirely, reduced to a torrent of white water and jagged debris. They sat huddled in silence, exhaustion etched into their faces. None of them had slept properly, their dreams poisoned by strange whispers and shapes shifting in the corners of their vision. Emma had awoken twice to the sound of soft footsteps circling the quarters, though when she looked, everyone was still in their sleeping bags. The lantern burned low, its light dim and wavering, giving the sense that the darkness was slowly reclaiming the room. To distract herself, Emma opened the ledger again. At first glance it was nothing more than a record book, dates, weather observations, notes on ships sighted at sea. But beneath those mundane details, other entries revealed themselves, scrawled in slanted handwriting between the lines, as though whoever wrote them was desperate to hide their meaning. "The knocking has returned. The door holds, but for how long? It feeds on storms. On fear." Her hands trembled as she turned the pages, the ink bleeding darker with each confession. "We are not alone in this place. It knows us. It whispers in our voices. If the tide uncovers the door, we must resist the temptation to look." Emma slammed the ledger shut, heart hammering. But Marcus had seen the look on her face. "What did you find?" he asked, voice low and strained. She hesitated. The air around them felt too heavy, as though the very walls were listening. But Zoe pressed closer, eyes wide, and Emma finally forced the words out. "The keepers knew. They knew something was down there. They wrote that it whispers. That it feeds when we're afraid." The room fell into an oppressive silence. Outside, the storm thundered as if to punctuate her revelation. Liam broke it, pacing the length of the room. "So, what, you're saying the lighthouse is haunted by something in the cavern? That it, what, reads our thoughts and messes with our heads? That's insane." But even as he said it, Emma saw the tremor in his hands. He didn't believe his own denial. As if in answer to his outburst, the lighthouse groaned, a deep, resonant sound that reverberated through stone and bone alike. And then the knocking returned, not below, but inside the very walls around them. 3 steady beats, like a hand pressing against the stone from within. Zoe clamped her hands over her ears, shaking her head violently. "Stop it! Just stop it," she cried. But the knocks persisted, louder this time, until dust rained from the ceiling and the lantern flickered dangerously. Emma felt it then, the pressure, the presence, as though the air itself leaned toward them, listening, tasting their fear. And over the storm, over the knocking, she heard it, a whisper threading directly into her mind. "We kept the secret. Now it is yours." Her throat tightened, her breath coming in short gasps. She looked around, desperate to see if anyone else had heard it, but the others' faces told her they had. Their eyes were wide, unfocused, and each of them seemed to be listening to something only they could hear. The storm raged outside, but the true danger was already inside. The storm kept battering the lighthouse as if the sea itself wanted to swallow it whole, but inside, another battle was unfolding, quieter, more insidious. The whispers had begun to divide them. At first, it was subtle, strange looks exchanged, awkward silences between words. But soon, each of them began hearing things they swore the others had said when, in truth, no one had spoken at all. Emma was the first to feel it. As she leaned against the cold stone wall, trying to steady her breathing, a voice brushed against her ear, soft and cruel. "Zoe blames you, Emma. She told Marcus you wanted to stay here. She thinks it's your fault they're all trapped." Her stomach clenched, her eyes darting to Zoe, who sat with her knees pulled up to her chest, avoiding everyone's gaze. Moments later, Marcus slammed his fist against the table, startling them all. His voice shook with rage. "Who told you?" he demanded, glaring at Liam. "How the hell would you know that?" I never said it aloud." Liam threw up his hands defensively, confusion etched into his face. "Said what?" "I didn't say anything." But Marcus wouldn't relent. His eyes were bloodshot, his breathing harsh. "You said I was scared, that I'd leave everyone behind if it came down to it. That I'd save myself." The room fell into silence, broken only by the storm's distant roar. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Until Liam finally whispered, "I didn't say that." Yet Emma knew the damage had already been done. The whispering wasn't just noise, it was choice. It planted words where none had been spoken, secrets where none had been confessed. It wanted them to turn on each other. By nightfall, the strain was unbearable. Zoe sat near the stairwell, hugging herself tightly, muttering under her breath. Emma approached cautiously, kneeling beside her. "What are you saying?" she asked gently. Zoe's eyes lifted, hollow and wild. It told me about you." Her voice cracked. "It said you've been dreaming of the cavern. That you want to open it. That you're curious." Emma froze, her skin crawling. The truth was, Zoe wasn't entirely wrong. The image of the rusted iron door had haunted Emma's thoughts since they'd first seen it. She hadn't told anyone, not wanting to feed the fear, but the idea of what might be sealed away beneath them lingered, a dark seed she couldn't pull from her mind. Before she could respond, the lantern sputtered, plunging the room into thick, suffocating dark. A collective gasp rose from the group, and in that blackness came a sound that didn't belong to any of them, the creak of the spiral staircase, deliberate and slow, as if someone unseen was ascending step by step. Lightning flared through the narrow window, illuminating the room for a heartbeat. And in that instant, Emma saw them all, but also saw another figure standing in the corner, drenched and faceless, its head tilted as if listening to the storm. When the darkness returned, the figure was gone. But the whispers remained, crawling in their ears, digging into their minds, feeding on the fractures between them. One of you will open the door. One of you already wants to. By the third night, the storm had become a ceaseless roar, a living thing that seemed to gnash at the lighthouse walls with teeth of salt and thunder. None of them could tell how much time had passed anymore. The sky was a constant gray blur, the sun swallowed by black clouds that seemed to circle the lighthouse itself. The group was fraying. Sleep-deprived eyes, trembling hands, every conversation and argument waiting to ignite. Emma tried to hold them together, but the whispers wouldn't stop. They came when she closed her eyes, when she blinked, when she tried to focus on the sound of the sea instead of the words clawing into her mind. Sometimes the voice was her mother's. Sometimes it was Zoe's, or Marcus's, or even her own. And always it said the same things, secrets she was never meant to know, doubts she didn't want to feel. Marcus took more food than the rest. Liam hides his fear behind his jokes. Zoe blames you for everything. Each whisper was a knife aimed at trust, slicing them thinner and thinner. That evening, it finally snapped. Marcus and Liam clashed first. A muffled argument about rationing escalated into shouting, accusations spilling out like blood from an open wound. I saw you sneaking extra water last night. Marcus shouted, his voice hoarse. You'll get us all killed if this storm doesn't pass. Liam, red-faced, spat back, better me than you. At least I don't sit there pretending to be the hero while planning to ditch us the first chance I get. The room was electric, the storm outside pounding in rhythm with their rage. Emma tried to step between them, but Zoe's voice cut through, sharp and trembling, stop it. Don't you see what it's doing to us? She pressed her hands against her head, nails digging into her scalp. It wants this. It wants us to turn on each other. But even her plea couldn't stitch them back together. The damage was already done. They stared at one another like strangers forced into the same cage, every shadow stretching suspicion across their faces. That night, no one slept. They sat apart, each clutching their own corner of the keeper's quarters. Emma lay awake, eyes burning, watching the faint glow of the lantern. The storm thundered outside, waves smashing the cliff with a force that shook the floor beneath her. And then she heard it, softer than the sea, lower than the thunder. A voice, curling beneath her pillow like smoke. You can stop this. Open the door, Emma. End the waiting. Free us. Her breath caught. She sat upright, scanning the darkened room, but the others were motionless, too exhausted to stir. The whisper lingered, pressing deeper into her skull. The keepers tried to resist. Look what happened to them. You are stronger, aren't you? You're curious. You already dream of the cavern. Her hands trembled as she clutched the ledger to her chest. The truth she hadn't dared speak aloud burned in her throat. The whisper was right. Part of her did want to see what lay behind that iron door, what had been hidden away for centuries. She hated herself for it, but the thought pulsed in her mind like a second heartbeat. And then, as if to drive the point home, the lighthouse gave another low groan, and the knocking resumed beneath the floor. 3 sharp raps, followed by a dragging sound, as if something enormous was shifting in the cavern below, testing the weight of its prison. Emma buried her face in her knees, trying to shut it out. But deep down, she already knew this wasn't just the lighthouse testing them. It was choosing them. By morning, the storm had not passed. It had deepened into something more unnatural, as though the world outside had been reduced to nothing but wind, water, and the groaning bones of the lighthouse. The air in the keeper's quarters was heavy, damp with salt and mildew, and every breath tasted of rust. None of them spoke much anymore. Words had become dangerous things, sparking arguments or betraying truths none of them were ready to face. Silence was safer. But silence was where the whispers crept in most clearly. Emma tried to focus on the ledger again, desperate for distraction, though her hands trembled as she turned the pages. The writing was worse now, lines of frantic script trailing into smears, blotches of ink like black tears staining the paper. The final entries weren't coherent sentences anymore, just fragments. The sea remembers. Not ours to hold. The cavern breathes. Some were scratched so violently into the page that the nib had torn the paper, the ink bleeding through in ugly spots. She could almost picture the last keeper, hunched in candlelight, scribbling in terror as something pressed closer and closer to his door. But what unsettled her more was what Marcus pointed out in a low voice, breaking the uneasy silence. "Do you see that?" he muttered, nodding toward the brass lantern resting on the windowsill. Emma glanced over, frowning. The glass of the lantern had fogged, as though something inside it was breathing. She moved closer, hesitating, and then froze. The fog on the glass wasn't random. It was forming shapes, letters. The others gathered reluctantly, dread dragging at their feet. One by one, letters scrawled across the fogged surface until a single word was etched in watery strokes, below. Zoe recoiled instantly, muttering no. "No, I won't look. I won't." She pressed her back against the wall as though the very sight of the word might drag her down into that hidden cavern. Liam gave a nervous laugh, thin and broken. "It's just condensation," he said, but his voice cracked. None of them believed him, not even he believed himself. The moment shattered when Emma glanced at the nearby mirror. It wasn't supposed to be there, no one remembered hanging it, but suddenly it was, cracked and tarnished, leaning against the wall as though it had always been part of the keeper's room. In its reflection, she saw herself, hunched and pale, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. But behind her reflection, in the place where Marcus and Zoe should have been, there were figures. Dozens of them. All gaunt, dressed in tattered coats, faces pale with the sickly gray of drowned bodies. They stood crowded together in silence, eyes fixed on her reflection, mouths moving as though whispering words she couldn't hear. Emma spun around in panic, heart hammering, but of course, nothing was there. Just Marcus, pale and angry, and Zoe, sobbing quietly into her sleeve. She turned back to the mirror, and the figures were still there. Closer this time. Their mouths wider. Their eyes hollow. Her hand shot out and she threw the mirror to the floor. The glass exploded in 1,000 shards, scattering across the damp wood. For a moment, relief washed through her, until she realized that every fragment of glass reflected the same thing. Dozens of drowned faces, whispering. Watching. Waiting. No one dared touch the shards. They left them where they fell, gleaming like teeth in the dim lantern light. That night, as the storm raged harder than ever, the tide finally receded. And with it, the cavern below was exposed more fully than before. Through the floorboards, they could hear it, a deep, cavernous exhale, like the breathing of something massive and ancient. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt like whatever was trapped below was listening, waiting for the moment when curiosity, fear, or desperation would finally drive them to open the iron door. Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when she realized something horrible. The whispers were no longer confined to the storm or the shadows. They were coming from her friends. Marcus muttered in his sleep, words not his own. Zoe sat upright in the dark, lips moving without sound, eyes glassy. Even Liam, who still tried to make jokes by day, now whispered through clenched teeth at night, a language none of them understood but all of them feared. The lighthouse was no longer just a building. It was a mouth. And they were trapped inside its throat. By the next morning, none of them had slept. The storm outside had raged through the night, slamming waves against the cliffs so violently the walls of the lighthouse quivered, yet the cavern's strange breathing persisted beneath it all, steady, patient, and unnatural. When dawn came, it was only a dull graying of the sky. The storm clouds were so thick it was impossible to tell where night ended and morning began. Emma sat on the cold floor with her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes raw from lack of sleep. The others were little better. Marcus hunched by the window, staring out at the endless sheets of rain, Zoe shivering beneath a damp blanket, and Liam pacing like a caged animal, whispering under his breath. The silence between them was brittle, like glass ready to shatter. And then it did. Liam stopped pacing, froze, and turned sharply toward the trapdoor leading down into the service level of the lighthouse. "It's calling," he muttered, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Don't you hear it? It's been calling all night. We're not supposed to stay up here. We're supposed to go down." "No," Zoe snapped, her voice shaking but forceful. "We're not going down there. That's what it wants. That's exactly what it wants." Liam let out a broken laugh, running his hands through his tangled hair. "And what's the alternative? Stay up here and starve? Wait for the storm to toss us into the sea? You think those whispers are going to stop just because we cover our ears?" He pointed to the ledger lying open on the table, its pages still stained with frantic, half-legible scrawls. The keepers knew. They went down. They wrote about it. Whatever's down there, whatever's breathing, it's the answer. It has to be. Marcus stood slowly, his fists clenched. He looked like he wanted to hit Liam, but instead he spoke with a low, simmering fury. The keepers didn't go down there because they wanted to. They went because they had no choice. And none of them came back. His eyes flicked to Emma, and for a second, she thought he was begging her to back him up, to remind Liam that reason still had a place in their nightmare. But Emma couldn't. Because Liam was right about one thing, the call had grown stronger. She hadn't wanted to admit it, not even to herself, but she had heard it too. Not in words, not in any language she recognized, but in a pulse that vibrated beneath her skin, in a whisper that seemed woven into the storm's howl. It was down there, waiting. And every second they resisted, it grew hungrier. By mid-afternoon, the decision was made for them. The storm tore a massive branch from a tree near the cliff, and the impact against the lighthouse shook the structure so violently that a section of the service floor cracked. When the dust cleared, they could see the faint glimmer of rusted iron below, part of the sealed grate that led into the cavern. The sight of it, the thing they had all tried not to think about, froze them where they stood. Marcus was the first to speak. "If we open that door, we don't come back. You know that, right?" But his words lacked conviction. Because they all knew the other truth as well, if they didn't open it, the lighthouse itself might tear them apart. With lanterns lit and their breaths tight in their throats, the four of them gathered around the cracked section of the floor. It took all of Marcus's strength to pry it wider, revealing the corroded iron grate beneath. When he finally lifted it, a rush of air exhaled from below, damp and foul, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of rot and salt water. The lantern flames flickered wildly, nearly snuffing out. The descent was steep and narrow. The iron ladder bolted to the stone wall was slick with moisture, groaning under their weight as they climbed down one by one. Emma went last, her fingers clamped around the rungs, the lantern strapped to her wrist casting jittering arcs of light. The further they descended, the colder the air grew, until their breath came in visible puffs. The sound of the storm above faded, replaced by something far worse, the low, steady sound of breathing, echoing from the cavern below, as though the stone itself had lungs. At the bottom, they found themselves in a space that looked carved by neither man nor nature. The walls were jagged and slick, glistening as though coated in some viscous film. The floor sloped downward toward a vast opening, a yawning black maw that pulsed with faint currents of air, each inhale and exhale filling the chamber with its rhythm. And then they saw them. The bones. Piled along the walls, half sunk in muck and seaweed, picked clean but arranged deliberately, almost ceremonially. Some were old, brittle and yellowed, while others still bore scraps of rotting fabric, uniforms not unlike the oilskin coats of lighthouse keepers. Skulls stared from the shadows, mouths frozen in silent screams. Zoe began to cry, her hands pressed over her mouth, her lantern shaking so badly the light stuttered. Liam, disturbingly calm, moved closer to the central opening. "It's not a cavern," he whispered. "It's a throat." As if in response, a sound rose from the depths, not the steady breathing they had heard before, but a voice. Not a single voice, but thousands, layered atop one another, hissing and whispering in languages both alien and familiar. And beneath them all, one vast, ancient voice that seemed to speak directly into their bones. Below. 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 The lanterns sputtered. The cavern's air grew wet and heavy, clinging to their skin like oil. Emma gripped the ladder behind her, her heart hammering so violently it felt as though it might burst. Something was down there, something that had been waiting long before the lighthouse was ever built. And now, it had their attention. The cavern seemed alive. Not in the way of an ordinary cave, damp, dripping, echoing, but in a way that made the skin crawl and the stomach turn. Every surface glistened with a sheen of moisture that wasn't just condensation but something thicker, like mucus. The stone walls pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, as though veins ran through them, carrying a sluggish current of something not meant for human eyes. Their lanterns cast faint halos of light, swallowed almost instantly by the vast darkness ahead, leaving everything beyond their narrow circle in oppressive shadow. Emma clutched her lantern to her chest, fighting the urge to gag at the stench of rot. The piles of bones surrounding them were no longer just anonymous remains. She began to notice details that made her stomach turn, the curve of a child's femur, the tatters of a shawl still clinging to a set of shoulders, a broken pocket watch wedged into a rib cage. These weren't just keepers. These were villagers, sailors, travelers, people who must have vanished from the coast over centuries, their ends never explained. All of them, she realized, had been fed to this place. Zoe's sobs echoed faintly, swallowed by the cavern's acoustics until they sounded like someone else crying in the dark. Marcus stepped forward, jaw tight, though his own fear was visible in the twitch of his shoulders. "We shouldn't be here," he muttered, voice low and urgent. "This isn't a cavern. It's a grave." But Liam disagreed. His expression was almost feverish now, lit by some mix of terror and awe. He knelt near the central opening, the black maw that exhaled and inhaled with dreadful patience, and whispered as though speaking to a priest. "It's not a grave. It's a mouth. And it's hungry." The moment he said it, the cavern stirred. A vibration rippled through the floor, knocking loose fragments of stone, sending ripples through the slick sheen on the walls. The breath grew louder, deeper, resonating through their chests until Emma felt her ribs shake. Then came the whispers again, layered, unending, ancient. They didn't just echo in her ears. They pressed into her mind, scraping against thoughts, tugging at fears she hadn't dared to think about in years. She heard her father's voice, sharp and disappointed, the words from her childhood cutting through the cavern, "You'll never amount to anything." She heard the drunken rages of her ex, the ones she had buried and sworn to forget, "No one else will ever love you." And under it all, a darker voice, something older, more primal, promising, "Come closer, and you will see the truth." Zoe collapsed to her knees, clutching her ears and screaming, "Stop it! Stop it!" But the voices didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. Marcus staggered back, shaking his head, muttering, "It's not real. It's not real." "Don't listen," but his face betrayed him. He was hearing something too, something that had stripped him raw. And Liam, God help them, was smiling. "It knows us," he whispered. "It's inside us already. Why fight it? Don't you understand? This is why we came. This is the secret the keepers tried to guard. This is older than them, older than the lighthouse, older than the cliffs themselves. This is the ocean's god, and it's been waiting for us." Emma's lantern flickered violently, and for a heartbeat she thought it would extinguish. In that instant of faltering light, she saw something move at the edge of the maw. Not a shadow, shadows don't glisten. It was slick and black, the size of a tree trunk, slithering back into the depths as though retreating from the flame. But just before it vanished, she caught a glimpse of something worse, a row of pale, human-like faces pressed into its surface, their mouths opening and closing in silence, as though screaming forever in the dark. Her stomach lurched and bile burned her throat. She staggered back, whispering, "We have to go. We have to go." But Liam shook his head violently. He stood now, arms outstretched toward the maw, his voice rising to match the whispers. "No. Don't you see? It doesn't want to kill us. It wants to keep us. To make us part of it. That's the secret. That's how the keepers survived for so long, they gave themselves willingly. Zoe snapped, lunging at him, pulling at his arm with desperate force. Shut up. Shut up, Liam. It's lying to you. Her shrieks echoed, breaking against the cavern walls like fragile glass. But Liam didn't even flinch. He stared into the blackness, transfixed, as if the ancient thing within was showing him something only he could see. Then the cavern floor shifted again, a violent heave that nearly knocked them off their feet. The maw expanded, not by stone crumbling, but by flesh stretching, widening into an abyss that swallowed the lantern light. The air that came out was no longer just damp but wet, splattering their faces with salty spray, as though the thing below had exhaled seawater itself. Emma grabbed Zoe's arm and Marcus's sleeve, pulling them back instinctively toward the ladder, but Liam stayed rooted. His eyes were wide and wet, his mouth trembling in ecstasy and terror. It's beautiful, he whispered. Can't you hear it? It's promising forever. And then, as if to answer him, the cavern spoke again, louder, clearer, rattling every stone in the walls. Below. The lanterns blew out. The darkness was absolute. Not the kind of darkness where your eyes could adjust, where faint outlines eventually emerged. This was a suffocating blackness that seemed to press against their skin, sliding over their faces and slipping into their lungs with every panicked breath. Emma clutched Zoe's trembling hand, her nails digging into flesh, desperate for some anchor to prove she wasn't alone. The sound of the storm above was gone now, swallowed entirely by the cavern's heartbeat rhythm. All that remained was the steady inhale and exhale of the thing below, and the chorus of voices that rose and fell like a tide. When Marcus managed to spark his lighter, the tiny flame was pitiful against the cavern's vastness. But it revealed just enough to make them wish it hadn't. The maw beneath them had widened further, not like stone breaking but like lips parting. The edge was slick, ridged, almost like gums, and from its depths came a faint glimmer, as though something wet and pulsating lay just beyond their sight, waiting. The air smelled worse now, not just of rot and salt but of iron, thick and coppery, the stench of blood so strong it clung to their tongues. Zoe sobbed openly, shaking her head, whispering, "No, no, no, no," like a prayer to herself. But Liam was gone from them. He stood at the edge of the abyss, his face illuminated by the tiny lighter's flame. His eyes gleamed with tears and something darker, his lips curved in awe. "This is the truth," he whispered, his voice strangely calm. "This is what the lighthouse was built to protect. Not ships. Not the coast. It." Emma's stomach turned at his words. She glanced toward Marcus, whose jaw was set tight, his knuckles white around the lighter. "We have to get out," she hissed, her voice ragged. "Now. Before it." But before she could finish, the voices surged again, drowning her words. They were clearer now, almost human, calling out names. Her name. Emma. The sound of her mother's voice, gentle and broken, the same tone she'd used in her last hospital bed farewell. "Emma, come closer. Don't leave me here." Her throat closed, tears springing to her eyes. She knew it wasn't real. She knew it was using her grief, but the ache of it nearly bent her knees. Marcus grunted, shaking his head violently. He shouted into the dark, his voice cracking, "You don't get to have us. Do you hear me? You don't get to." His words seemed to echo unnaturally, as though the cavern itself mocked him. Then the floor shifted again, and something rose from the maw. At first, Emma thought it was stone, an immense pillar pushing upward, but then the lighter's flame caught its surface, and she saw the truth. Flesh. Wet, gray, glistening flesh. The pillar was studded with faces, dozens of them, pressed outward like trapped souls straining against the surface. Their mouths opened and closed soundlessly, their eyes rolling, their features distorted by the shifting, pulsating mass beneath. Zoe screamed, stumbling back, nearly dragging Emma with her. But Liam didn't move. He stepped forward instead, reaching out as though to touch it. "Don't you see?" he cried. They're not dead. They're part of it. This is eternity. This is the Keeper's bargain. Emma's heart froze at that word, the Keeper. The journals, the frantic scrawls, the desperate prayers to hold the line. She understood then. The lighthouse hadn't been built to warn sailors away. It had been built to guard the thing below. To keep it contained. And when the keepers failed, or gave in, this was what happened. They became its voices. Its faces. Its flesh. Marcus lunged forward, grabbing Liam's arm, yanking him back from the edge. You don't get to feed it. You don't get to decide for all of us, he snarled. But Liam fought him, twisting with unnatural strength, his eyes wild, his voice no longer entirely his own. It's too late. Don't you hear it? It already chose us. One of us has to stay, one of us has to be the new keeper. The cavern seemed to agree. The breath quickened, shaking the walls, sending showers of stone dust raining down from above. The voices roared now, thousands upon thousands, demanding in unison. Choose. Emma felt her knees weaken. It was no longer asking. It was commanding. They weren't going to leave this place together. One of them was meant to remain, bound to the lighthouse, feeding the hunger below, guarding its secret until the next doomed souls arrived. Her gaze met Marcus's, raw and desperate, and then flicked to Zoe, who was trembling, broken, unable to even look up from the ground. And finally, she looked at Liam, already half lost, his body leaning toward the abyss as though gravity itself had claimed him. The cavern roared again. The flesh rose higher, faces pressing closer, their whispers searing into her skull. Choose. 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 Emma realized with a terrible certainty that the lighthouse would not release them until someone was given. The cavern's command echoed like thunder, rattling Emma's bones, filling every hollow in her chest until her lungs seemed ready to burst. Choose. The word wasn't sound anymore. It was pressure, heat, a vibration that invaded muscle and marrow. The lantern light wavered, its flame bending as though pulled toward the gaping maw. All around them, the stone walls pulsed like veins, slick with the sheen of something alive, something eternal. Emma clutched Zoe tighter, though her own legs shook violently. Marcus's lighter sputtered again, threatening to die. His face was a mask of raw defiance, but beneath it Emma saw despair. He knew, just as she did, that this wasn't a threat they could run from. The storm, the isolation, the endless hunger below, the lighthouse itself was a prison, and the only key was sacrifice. Liam tore free of Marcus's grip, staggering to the edge of the abyss. His voice was no longer entirely his own, it was layered, thousands of voices speaking through his throat, a chorus that made Emma's stomach knot. Don't you understand? He cried. We've already been chosen. There's no escape. One of us will keep the light, and the rest will feed it. His eyes gleamed with madness, or perhaps clarity. It's mercy. It's eternity. Emma's body screamed at her to flee, to climb the ladder and never look back, but some terrible instinct told her that the lighthouse would never let them go, not unless its bargain was fulfilled. She glanced at Zoe, who crouched against the wall, her small frame quivering, her eyes squeezed shut as she whispered a childlike prayer. Then her gaze shifted to Marcus. He held the lighter like a weapon, though its flame was pitiful against the darkness. His jaw was set, but his eyes flickered with something Emma had never seen in him before, fear of dying helpless. Her heart twisted. They were trapped in a story that had played out countless times before, she realized. The bones, the faces, the whispers, they were all pieces of the same truth. The lighthouse keepers hadn't all failed. Some had chosen. Some had stayed. And that was why the light had continued to burn for decades after the world outside forgot them. That was why the cavern still waited. The voices surged again, louder than the storm, than her thoughts, than her own heartbeat. Choose. 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 The floor lurched beneath them, the maw widening, a blast of foul, briny air knocking the lighter from Marcus's hand. Darkness swallowed them, broken only by the faint bioluminescent glow deep within the abyss, an otherworldly light pulsing like the heartbeat of some ancient god. For one terrible instant, Emma thought she saw its true form rising, a monstrous coil of flesh, slick and endless, studded with the faces of those who had been taken. Eyes blinked within the mass, hundreds of them, wet and unblinking. And every face turned toward her. Zoe screamed, the sound raw and piercing, and Emma snapped. Her voice cut through the madness, ragged but fierce. "Take me!" The words spilled before she could stop them, her body trembling violently. "Take me, just let them go!" The cavern stilled. The breath paused. The voices hushed, like a sea holding its tide. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then the maw inhaled deeply, and Emma felt her body pulled forward, her skin tingling, her chest constricting as though invisible hands wrapped around her ribs. "No!" Marcus roared, grabbing her arm, fighting against the pull. His face was twisted with fury and grief, his strength desperate but failing. Zoe sobbed louder, screaming her name. And Liam simply smiled, his eyes shining with unholy reverence. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, it accepts you. The Keeper." Emma's feet slid closer to the edge, her nails clawing at Marcus's sleeve. "Go," she gasped, her voice breaking under the pressure crushing her lungs. "Take Zoe and run. Don't look back." She tried to push him away, but Marcus clung tighter, tears streaking down his face. "Not you," he hissed. "Not you, damn it. I won't let it take you." But the cavern had already decided. The pull grew stronger, and Emma knew this was her role. This was the story that had always been written. One soul bound, the others spared, for now. With the last of her strength, she shoved Marcus backward, sending him stumbling into Zoe's arms. Their cries echoed, breaking her in half, but she didn't falter. She stepped forward willingly, into the maw. The world became salt and darkness and screaming faces. Cold water closed over her skin, crushing her lungs, searing her veins. The whispers filled her skull, shredding thought, replacing it with endless voices. But amid the agony, there was also something else, a light. Not warm, not human, but eternal. She understood then what the Keepers had seen, what had broken them, what had trapped them here forever. The lighthouse above shuddered, its great beam flaring to life once more, slicing through the storm with unnatural brilliance. From the cliff's edge, Marcus and Zoe clung to each other, watching as the lantern at the top blazed brighter than it ever had, piercing the black sky. And in that light, Marcus thought he saw her, Emma, standing tall, her face pale, her eyes no longer her own. The storm began to calm. The tide receded. The cavern sealed itself with a shuddering groan, leaving only silence behind. The bargain had been fulfilled. Zoe sobbed into Marcus's chest, her words fractured. "She's gone. She's gone." But Marcus couldn't answer. He stared up at the blazing light, jaw tight, his stomach sinking with a terrible truth. Emma wasn't gone. She was the Keeper now. And one day, when the tide rose again and the cavern whispered choose, someone else would stand where he was, staring into the light, knowing that below it, Emma's voice would be waiting. Forever.